Nikon brought us to Florida to test the new Nikon Z6, a 24-megapixel mirrorless full-frame camera. We started with the ultimate challenge, wildlife from a moving boat. The Z6 was able to produce professional, usable results. Still, it missed focus much of the time, and we missed a lot of shots while the camera hunted. The Z6 advertises 11 frames per second, which is really fast, but that produces significant viewfinder lag. If you try to shoot moving subjects at 11 frames per second, you'll find it impossible to keep up. Therefore, you can use 11 frames per second for still subjects where you don't really need it, but you need to drop down to 5 frames per second for moving subjects if you're going to keep them in the frame. The sensor is the opposite of what you'd want for wildlife. It's full frame, a fairly low 24 megapixels, and it has a sharpness reducing AA filter. You don't want to get too close to wildlife, so you usually need to crop heavily. A refurbished D500 with a smaller sensor is about 30% less expensive than a Z6 and the FTZ adapter, and the D500 would produce about twice the detail, better focusing, and it has a real 10 frames per second for wildlife. If you're a serious wildlife photographer, the Z6 just is not the best choice. But the Z6 is a jack of all trades, and if you want to occasionally shoot wildlife, the Z6 can do it. Next, we shot posed portraits in an aircraft hangar. Overall, the Z6 performed well, but it did have its challenges. First, there are no native portrait lenses for the Z-mount, so we used the $250 FTZ adapter to mount our amazing 105mm f1.4. It's great to be able to use our favorite portrait lens on a mirrorless camera. If you want to use Nikon lenses on a mirrorless camera, the Z6 or the Z7 are the best cameras for that, no doubt. However, the portrait lens produces such shallow depth of field that it requires very precise focusing, and the Z6 regularly misfocused. As a result, we were forced to overshoot to be confident that we would get at least one shot in focus. Focusing completely failed us in backlit scenarios, which are common in portraits. As a result, we had to switch to manual focus. Another challenge for both the Z6 and the Z7 is auto white balance. It's the worst we've experienced in any modern camera. You need to set it manually or risk shots with really weird colors, even in daylight. It's fairly easy to fix in post, but wedding and event photographers shooting in mixed lighting often rely on auto white balance to speed their post-processing. Metering on the Z6 and Z7 is primitive too. Most modern cameras, including Nikon's own D850 and D750, as well as most of the mirrorless competition, will detect and properly expose a face in the scene. The Z6 and Z7 can only do this in face detection mode, which isn't accurate enough for portraits. In single AF point mode, the Nikon mirrorless cameras use basic metering to expose the scene. As a result, we had to constantly adjust exposure compensation to get the right exposure. If we didn't do that, the Z cameras would underexpose backlit portraits, often by several stops. Wait, did you see the Z6's rolling shutter in this whip pan? Probably not, because only video snobs care about rolling shutter, and I regularly see it in TV and movies. The Z6 has it, and it's not the best, and it's not the worst, and pretty much every camera in this segment has it.
We're at Epcot before it opens.
The Z6 has a stabilized sensor like the Sony a7 III. That should be a big advantage over the Canon EOS R and Fujifilm X-T3, except that it didn't work well for video. Here's some staged B-roll that Chelsea handheld. Notice the sensor stabilization adds very strange jiggles, and it makes the footage unusable. Other clips look fine, but we can't have stabilization wrecking random clips, so we'd want to turn it off before filming anything serious. 120 frames per second slow motion recorded sound, and it used the full width of the sensor, making it vastly superior to the Canon EOS R and on par with the Sony a7 III. The Z6 supports 4K at 30 frames per second with 10-bit color and high dynamic range N-Log when using an external field recorder like the $700 Ninja 5. With the SSD and rig you need, you'll spend an extra $1,000 for this setup. As you can see in this side-by-side example, the 10-bit does look a little bit better in the recovered shadows in extremely high contrast situations like this. If you're a serious filmmaker, carrying the extra rig and managing the huge video files might be worth it too. For our purposes, the extra gear and post-processing required just isn't worth it.
How does it look without N-Log? This is how it looks without N-Log. We're in Disney and Epcot, and we're testing the Nikon Z6. This is an amazing location to see what the autofocus is like, the dynamic range, the handling. We're super excited. I often shoot with the D850, and transitioning to the Z6 was just seamless. Everything's pretty much in the same place. It doesn't feel like a small camera. It's got a nice deep grip. It's easy to hold, easy to use, and the handling's very similar. I've really been enjoying shooting with it so far.
The focusing feels like it's working pretty well, and in fact it feels like it's working better than the Z7, though I haven't tested them side by side yet. I love that the focusing points go right to the edge of the frame. If you're thinking about upgrading from a D750, you really appreciate that. The focus tracking for video and moving models has worked really well for me too. If you're thinking about this versus like a Sony or a Fuji, they offer eye detect autofocus, which is really valuable if you're working with a shallow depth of field. But if you have an existing cache of Nikon lenses that you want to keep using, you can't put those on your Sony or your Fuji and get good results. Therefore, the Nikon Z6 is probably your best bet.
While the Z cameras don't have eye detection autofocus now, Nikon has promised it for a future firmware update. Subscribe to see our test when that feature is available. As a mirrorless camera, the Z6 does have several advantages over the Nikon DSLRs. It allows edge-to-edge focusing, eliminating the need to focus and recompose. You can also preview your exposure in the viewfinder, so you never need to chimp. However, if you're a Nikon portrait photographer considering the Z6, we recommend saving yourself over $1,000 and buying a used Nikon D750 DSLR instead. A D750 would produce the same quality images with the same lenses at half the price, with no need for an adapter, and it includes faster focusing and 2 card slots. The Z6 has the best video focusing of any Nikon camera ever. Nikon made a huge leap in their technology. However, they're still far behind Canon, Sony, and Fuji. Even in good light, autofocusing often missed the main subject, choosing to focus on the background. Fortunately, I could touch the screen to manually pick a focusing point. Focus often hunted after we started recording, ruining the shot. While I wouldn't choose the Z6 for vlogging or serious run-and-gun video, the Z6 video autofocus is good enough for casual shooters or more serious filmmakers using manual focus. Later that night, we headed to Epcot to catch the fireworks show. Walking there, I discovered that the Z6 4K video looks great, even in low light with native f1.8 primes. Because it's sampling the full width of the sensor without skipping any pixels, it outperforms the Canon EOS R, Nikon Z7, Nikon D850, and Sony a7R III. Making it one of the best low-light video cameras ever made. It's on par with the Sony a7 III. However, the Z6's sensor stabilization was really jarring for filming while walking, and no current native lens offers optical stabilization. Auto white balance was a constant problem in all lighting situations, requiring us to manually set the white balance. As I mentioned earlier, video autofocus is better than any other Nikon camera, even better than Panasonic. However, it's still way behind Canon and Sony's latest mirrorless cameras. Unfortunately, it's lacking a flip screen. It's not just vloggers that need to see themselves. Most families take selfies. Unfortunately, without a flip screen, you're better off using your smartphone. See that sensor dust? That's a big problem with mirrorless cameras that don't close the shutter when you change your lens. The sensor is just exposed to the environment. It's easier to fix on stills than in video. If you're a Nikon shooter, you don't want to sell your lenses, and you must go mirrorless, the Z6 and the Z7 are the only ways to do it. But most people would be happier shooting with a Nikon D750 or D850 DSLR. They're two of the best DSLRs ever made, and they're still the best cameras Nikon has ever made. That's great news for Nikon shooters. Put your wallet back in your pocket, because we just saved you thousands. you already have the best cameras. These are Nikon's first generation full-frame mirrorless cameras, and they're great. They're the best mirrorless cameras of 2016, but a lot has changed in the last 3 years. Sony and Fuji have a huge head start in both bodies and lenses. Most people buying their first mirrorless camera should start there.
So good. Now the best Cheetos are Cheetos Crunchy. Okay? Those are the best ones. Also, if you want to get a fiery Cheeto, that's good too. It has the most vitamins and minerals of any other food. You can see here, vitamin D, 0%. Okay, it has no vitamins and minerals.
But your fingers look wonderful.
Don't
try to hide it now.
No, they taste great too.
You got orange fingers.
The perfect food. What's in it? Cornmeal, vegetable oil, cheese seasoning, canola oil, maltodextrin, made from corn, natural and artificial natural flavors, healthy, salt, whey protein concentrate. I'm actually allergic to that, but I've never eaten enough Cheetos to see anything happen. Monosodium glutamate, lactic acid, citric acid, artificial color. Thought it was real. And salt.
Your review is much more thorough than I anticipated.